There's troubling new data that confirms an ongoing problem in the racial makeup of the nation's largest school system. In 2014, the Civil Rights Project at UCLA reported that New York State was the most segregated state in the nation for black students. About 8 years later, they found the problem is still the same. The group has just released updated data today that finds in 2018 about 85% of black students in New York attended what the study called intensely segregated, predominantly non-white schools, compared with about 11% of white students. Achievement gaps are also significant. While white and Asian students in both math and English language arts are overwhelmingly soaring in the top 20% of all scores, the majority of black and Latino students are soaring in the lowest 20% of all scores. And acceptance rates at the specialized schools that are highly unequal in the city as well, favoring a heavily white and Asian student enrollment. In 2018, on average, 82% of enrollment in those schools were white and Asian, and only 15% were black, Latino, and American Indian. Joining me now to discuss is co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, Gary Orfield. Professor Orfield, what explains this kind of segregation in the New York State and New York City school system? People think of these as diverse cities, but diversity does not equate to integration, but looks like balkanization.
Yeah, when you walk through Times Square, you think that's the world in front of you and that there's some of everything there and everybody's close together. But New York City is very segregated residentially and extremely segregated educationally. It's one of the few major school districts in the country that never had a significant desegregation plan. It promised to do things voluntarily, but never did them. And basically, there is no effort. And there's been a creation of a huge amount of school choice that's been done without any civil rights requirements built in. And the choice has tended to exacerbate the differences. The charter schools that have been created, for example, since the 90s, are even more segregated than the regular public schools, almost absolutely segregated in places like the Bronx.
So what is the answer to this? The mayor, Mayor de Blasio, tried to take steps that would have increased enrollment of black and Latino students at the specialized high schools. There was a major pushback on that, and he basically failed at it. What is the answer here?
If you're going to change things, you have to have a goal, and you have to have some means to do it. And a lot of other places have done it over time. So it's not a mystery what you have to do. If you want to change the enrollment of the highly selective schools, you have to do what all the Ivy League schools have done, not choose students on the basis of one stupid, inadequate measure, which is one test. And those tests are so heavily related to family advantage and to advantage of earlier schooling that they just perpetuate inequality. And it is a mechanism for extending this inequality between the generations. So you have to consider other kinds of talent that aren't reflected in tests. The tests measure a certain range of skills. They don't measure your ultimate ability. They don't measure your motivation. They don't measure your creativity. And they don't measure what you can do if you're offered an opportunity that the students in the ghettos and barrios of New York City are rarely offered. So we learned what I taught at Harvard or Princeton. We were out there trying to intentionally integrate our campuses. And it's been done. And it's created richness for everybody on those campuses. It hasn't disadvantaged anybody. It's helped prepare people to get ready for life in a multiracial society. New York doesn't have a plan like that. To do it is not a mystery. It's being done many places. You have to decide to do it, and then you have to put up with the fuss that develops when you decide to do it because everybody thinks they're losing something. We did a big study of Buffalo, New York, where they've resegregated their best school by a similar method. if you're going to change it, you have to decide to change it, and somebody has to take the flak until it's changed. Once it's changed, everybody will like it, and they'll wonder why it wasn't done a long time before.
But isn't that the irony here, which is that New York likes to bill itself as this progressive liberal city, but it is the city that fights the hardest any effort to change this about its schools.
But they all fight hard at the time when they begin to think about changing and the demagogues start stirring up fears until you actually do the change and people discover, well, it really isn't very hard and it's very positive. It's a very positive experience for kids from Washington Heights to know that the kids in the East, in the Lower East Side have the same basic values, are curious about each other, want to learn from each other. We decided to do this report because teenagers in New York are out there protesting against the segregation that they're being educated in, which disadvantages them for the future of life in the city.
Let's talk about those disadvantages. What are the long-term deleterious effects of this kind of hyper segregation in schooling?
Well, what they do is they create what Martin Luther King used to describe as a false assumption of superiority by the people who get the best opportunities and a false assumption of inferiority by the people who are in the most disadvantaged schools where they don't get a fair chance. They divide people socially. They deny people the right to acquire the skills to cross over these lines of race and class and language. They deny the possibility of sharing good things that communities have. For example, the Chinese-speaking and the Spanish-speaking populations in New York have access to fluent use of a world language that would be an advantage for many of the white and black students in the city that just have one language. You can bring them together, teach each other, learn from each other. It's an enrichment. I was many, many years ago, I taught at Princeton just when it began to integrate. It was tremendously exciting because people were seeing each other, meeting each other for the first time. And who knew that something like Michelle Obama was going to come out of that experiment, and many other very talented people. Mm-hmm. Crossing those lines is empowering for Americans. Americans know that something's wrong. The great majority of Americans think we should do something. But every time something concrete is proposed, they get scared. And there are people who go out and arouse their fears. And the political leaders typically collapse at that time. That's why courts are good things, because it forces you to do something.
Well, let's hope that Americans and particularly people in New York can get over that fear. Professor Orfield, thank you so much for joining me tonight, sir.
Well, thank you. And there's very many good things that could be done in New York and lots of talent to do them.
Thank you so much, sir.